Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. And thank those of you who even joined a few minutes early as we were setting up. You've seen the backstage action. Now we're actually on stage. And this talk is about reinventing African art museums in changing times. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me to say what a great honor and pleasure it is for me to host this webinar for 154. I actually had a conversation on Zoom with Touria El Glaoui, the founder of 154, last month. And I said that I was a 154 evangelist and super fan because I've been to pretty much every 154 fair in London, New York, and Marrakesh since it started. And I always want to remind everyone how important it is to support 154 because of the way that Touria, Margot, and their team have been able to bring us together around the promise and the potential and the wonderful opportunity around contemporary African art. So again, it's wonderful to see so many people coming from all over the world. We're all virtually gathered to discuss, well, the excitement around contemporary African art, but specifically with a focus on cultural institutions, and in this case, museums and cultural centers. So without further ado, as we wait for Koyo Kuyo, who's going to be joining us shortly from Cape Town and the Zeitz MoCA Museum, I wanted to introduce Sonia Lawson, who is the founder and director of the Palais de Lomé in my hometown, Lomé, Togo. And so the museum's been open for about 6 months now, and I'll let Sonia in a minute tell you a little bit more about what she's doing. And we also have Karen Milbourne, who's a senior curator at the National Museum of African Art, which is one of the crown jewels of the wonderful Smithsonian Institution. So Karen is an art historian, and she has very much been at the forefront of leading some of the most exciting exhibitions at the National Museum of African Art. So perhaps as we get started, perhaps because I have to promote my hometown in Togo, because I don't get to talk about Togo as much as I'd like to, perhaps Sonia, you can tell us a little bit about the Palais de Lomé and what it is. And I know that there's a couple of images that you want to share, which I will share as part of the share screen function that I have on Zoom. That's my privilege of being a moderator. I can just share things when I want to. So please tell us about the Palais de Lomé and let me know when you want me to share those two images that you sent me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Claude. Yes, I'm very excited to present the Palais de Lomé. The Palais de Lomé was the former governor's palace in Togo, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. So we are very lucky with a 26-acre park. And this former governor's palace was abandoned for 20 years and then transformed into an art and culture center. So what I want to say is that it's a statement for us because we use the symbol of colonization to present the Africa of today and even tomorrow. So we shift a symbol of oppression into something thanks to the creative talents of Africa. So it's a venue that is cross-disciplinary and wants to showcase really the creative talents in several fields, be it art, design, or biodiversity, that I will speak later on about. So that's a brief presentation of the Palais de Lomé. And so yes, and we have several exhibitions, but I think we will reverse on that later. So that's the brief presentation.
Okay, I think the screen sharing function was temporarily disabled, so we'll get back to that as soon as Karen talks to us a little about your particular institution within the Smithsonian.
Well, one of the things I think a lot of people don't realize, well, actually, again, first, let me say thank you to you, Claude, for moderating. This is wonderful. It's such a pleasure to be on screen with you, Sonia, and soon Koyo as well. One of the things I think a lot of folks don't realize about the Smithsonian is that we are not one museum, but 19 different museums, 9 research centers, and a zoo. We have locations on at least 3 different continents, and I believe roughly 7,000 employees. So it's the largest museum complex, of which the National Museum of African Art is just one part, although a part that I hold very dear and think is quite important. The museum itself also has a really I think, not well enough understood history, where it was formed before the Smithsonian as the Center for Cross-Cultural Understanding. So it seems really timely with what's happening right now to recognize that it was founded in 1964 as a response to the civil rights movement in the US. So the founding director had actually returned from being a foreign service officer in Germany, where he'd fallen in love with the arts from Gabon, from Benin, from Tanzania, and returned and saw what was going on. And that despite the incredible efforts of Howard University, of Hampton, of the Harman Foundation, that there wasn't enough attention being paid to the incredible accomplishments that had been coming from for centuries from the African continent. And so he set out to create a museum in the home of the great diplomat, intellectual, and formerly enslaved laborer Frederick Douglass. So that's actually how we got our start. And it wasn't until 15 years later that we became part of the Smithsonian, and roughly 10 years after that, that we moved on to the National Mall, to our current location. And currently we are a museum dedicated to the arts of the entire African continent, from our collection ranges from the 11th century to contemporary commissions.
So Karen, I have my sharing superpowers again, so I'm able to share the two images that you wanted the participants to see. But while I figure it out, I'm wondering why a white woman like you got interested in African art in this way. Because I saw that you did your art history PhD at the University of Iowa. It doesn't get more Midwest than that. And now we're talking about Africa. So can you tell us the backstory while I share these images with everyone?
Well, the obvious answer is, well, why not? But to get a little bit more specific than that, I should say that University of Iowa gave the first PhD in African art history in the United States back in the 60s. So Roy Sieber, who would go on to start the program at Indiana University, actually got his PhD out of Iowa. So I went there from New York City, where I was working at the Museum for African Art, because at the time it was the only program that had 4 African art historians teaching at one university. And most places, if they had anyone, only had one person. So it seemed pretty fantastic to have the opportunity to be able to learn from, multiple voices. So, and I should say that I've, as an adult, never done anything else. As an undergrad, I was a studio major and studied abroad at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, and graduated with an independent major in African studies and studio art. And so this is, it's been my great privilege to have been able to work with the material and the artists that I love since I was a kid. I mean, I was, I think, 19, and Ella Natsui would let me sit in his studio while he was working. Obiora and Ada Udochukwu had a party one night where they did a slideshow so that I could see artworks by all of the artists who were passing through in Nsukka at the time. And, Sylvester Obechie was a student there at the time. I mean, or I guess he'd actually graduated his master's, but he was still in Nsukka. It was just an extraordinary time and an extraordinary place to be able to study. And when I came back, I graduated from Bryn Mawr College, and they were given an African art collection and they didn't have anyone to work with it. So as a college student, I was handed this collection and allowed to try and interpret it. So I did multiple exhibitions as an undergrad, and then went to work.
Wonderful. I'm wondering if the screen share is working, because I think I'm able to pull up the first of your images. Can everybody see this image of the front of the museum?
Yes, actually.
Great. Okay, wonderful. So what is that? Tell us about it, Karen.
So actually that is the facade of the museum. So I thought that for people who have not yet had the opportunity to visit Washington, DC, which I hope, as many as possible will be able to. And for those who can't, we'll figure out better digital means of partnering globally. But our museum was actually built on the National Mall as a mirror to the Asian Art Museum, so that it's considered an international complex on the National Mall. So when you see that iconic vista from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, the greenway that runs along the middle has most of the Smithsonian museums, or many of them, including ours. And because we were built at a time when no one was supposed to be taller than the Central Smithsonian Museum, which is called the Castle, our building is primarily underground. So what you see is this one-story plaza, but then it continues for 3 stories underground, and as I said, connects to the Asian Art Museum. And one of the things that I love is that we have been able to install Yinka Shonibari CBE's fabulous Wind Sculpture 7, which he actually designed especially for us. And for those of you who enjoy looking at FaceTime or Facebook Live videos, it's really remarkable to see the sculpture installed, because what you have to realize is that it's actually on our roof. So there was less than a meter of soil, and we had to actually block off Independence Avenue and get a crane and lift it into place. And it took roughly 2 years to figure out the engineering of how to get it in place with a mount that wouldn't freeze and that could withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. But it seems like such the appropriate symbol for a museum that honors the contributions of Africans globally. That here is a sculpture based on the sails of ships that connected the world, and pays tribute to the accomplishments of those who have traveled from the continent and contributed worldwide.
Great. We also have these another image here, which is a little bit cropped, which is not ideal, but I guess
Yeah.
we get the picture. So can you tell us a little bit about that image?
So this is part of an exhibition and book. So the book is easily still available. The exhibition is currently only online, called I Am Contemporary Women Artists of Africa. And it's part of a broader initiative at the museum. So within the book, really what I tried to do is look at the history of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art as just one example of how we can understand why we are still in a situation of profound underrepresentation of women artists. So I did an assessment of our collection, I guess 6 years ago now, and at that time learned that even though we had been collecting what gets called modern and contemporary African art as a museum since 1966, we only had 11% of the named artists in our collection identified as women. And so we recognized that that, was not okay. And we've since raised it to 22%. And so this book sort of traces that history of how collections get formed and how Africa's women artists have been identified or classified in groups through literature and exhibitions, and then tries to sort of provide a way of looking at and expanding on this topic. And then, of course, this iconic image of Bungwane by
Go ahead.
Nellie Moholi.
Yeah.
Photograph.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really happy that Zanele Moholi and Yinka Shonibari's names came up in the first 20 minutes, as they always do in every talk I have on contemporary African art. So that was great. I promise this is not a presentation, but it's really more of a conversation / discussion. But I do want to show 2 images that Sonia wanted us to see. So the first one, I think I know what it is. The cropping is a bit off, Sonia, but tell us a little bit. You take it away.
Yes, the idea is that this venue, symbol of colonialism, will showcase the Africa of tomorrow. What I wanted to share with you is that what is very important for us is to be able to restore heritage and history. But also what we want to do is to showcase it within biodiversity, with the theme of biodiversity. So the picture shares that it's inside nature, inside the park, It's overlooking Atlantic Ocean. And so I just wanted for those of you who don't know the venue, to present it, to have an image of it, to present it briefly. You think the sound is not good? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay now. It wasn't great, but it's okay now. Keep going.
Okay, so yes, so that's the idea. And so the theme of we have several exhibitions with several themes. And what I like in what you said about Shoni Barre or Zainele is that for the time being, the contemporary artists are not very well known in Togo. So the objective is to that for a conversation with everyone or many people, not only the, I would say the circle of the art lover, the small circle of the art lover in Togo, but a broader audience might be able to quote contemporary African artists like we did in our conversation. So the objective here is also to bring these contemporary artists and art into an audience that has never been exposed to it for the majority of it. So it's, I hope one day that when we quote Yinka Shoni Barre or Zanele, it will be totally natural for them to say, yes, of course, we know their work. So, and
Sonia, it's always, you know, Yinka Shoni Barre, Zanele Muholi, South Africa, Yinka, Nigeria, or Elanatsui, Nigeria. Those, in Ghana, those names always come up, but, you know, in my, 20 years speaking of African art, Togo never comes up. So tell us a little bit about that, Sonia.
Yes, Togo never come up. That's true, because we didn't have the art world of Togo, of course. As like the rest of the continent, the country is bubbling with creativity, but it just didn't have the places and venues to be able to exhibit it, be it galleries. So we just have a few galleries, and we didn't have any cultural institution to be able to present the work of the artist. So it's the very first for us to have a place where the artist can be exhibited and the contemporary art can be exhibited as well. So, and that's, I think that when you don't have many places to be able to exhibit the works, it's very hard to be, it's hard to get to the knowledge of and the general conversation of people from other countries, because they don't, Togo wasn't in their mind because also of the lack of places, exhibitions, and it's an ecosystem. So I hope that we will contribute to that, so that the Togolese artists will be better known to the rest of the continent and the rest of the world as well. And
great. Sonia, you wanted me to share this image as well. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, this image, well, I wanted to share it to you because we had we had a conversation with the curator, the British Nigerian curator Aminat Agoro, about.
Hi, Koyo. Welcome to our talk.
Hello. Sorry.
Yeah, we're all having technical difficulties today. So we're all having technical difficulties.
Yeah. Oh, c'est quoi ça encore?
No, we hear you, Koyo.
C'est incroyable ces trucs. Okay. Well, I don't know if you hear me. I don't see anything. It's a whole mess in my technology today. So
we can see you. We can see you. We can see you and we can hear you. But Sonia was just finishing up, and I wanted to switch to you right after Sonia.
Yes. Okay. So the idea here is just an example, because you asked me the question, how can we do? So yes, how can we be relevant to our audience as well is also one of the questions. So with the curator Aminat Agoro, what we decided for her approach for the first exhibition, for one of the 5 exhibitions, so-called Free Borders, is to have a Pan-African approach with artists across the region, so the West Africa region, from Nigeria to Ghana, Benin, Togo, and to engage a conversation about borders, but also about materiality. So materiality, because the audience that is not exposed to contemporary art and don't always know since it's a discovery for them. So we wanted to approach them with this theme. So what you see here is a work by Tete Azanko, but it's a work done in enamel. So it's the enamel plates and bowls that you can find that people in West Africa are very familiar with. I don't know if it's the case in other parts of Africa. So we use something very familiar, but to express a uniqueness of the artist. So the audience was very, I would say they were very puzzled because and appreciative, because they said, well, it's something that sounds for us very mundane and object of everyday life. And we couldn't imagine that out of this object, we can do something that is art. So it was one approach to them throughout materiality. So we had artists working with gallons, plastic gallons, or Serge Clotet from Ghana, beat with gallon, with earth. So several mediums of expression that are very familiar, but at the same time, that are transformed into something else. So it was a real discovery for our audience, because we wanted to find a link to approach our audience with something that they can relate to. And I think, given their comments, that it was a success, because it was a means for us to attract them with contemporary art, saying, well, contemporary art can be this. It's one proposal. In the next exhibition, you will see another proposal. So it's something. So that's why I wanted to share this image with you that is very familiar, but unique at the same time.
Thank you, Sonia. I want to really switch to Koyo now and welcoming her. Koyo, you are running one of the most important museums in Africa, certainly with respect to contemporary art, and you're in Cape Town. But because of Africa's demographics, I was thinking of starting out by asking you how today's African art museums can strike a balance between presenting historical narratives and sparking the imaginations of younger generations of Africans who, quite frankly, represent most of the population. Some people forget that 60% of the African population is under the age of 25. So how do you strike that balance between history and future imaginations, Koyo?
Oh, well, first of all, good evening, everyone, and sorry for my horrible delay due to technology. And I always say that technology has spirits. I do lots of Zooms every day, but this one just didn't want me to start in time. So I apologize for that. It is not me being late, it's technology messing up with me. And thank you, 154, for the invitation. Hello, Sonia. Hello, Karen. Hello, Claude. To answer your question, I really believe that we have to learn humility, institutional humility. Dzeit Smoker is just one of the newest initiatives. I don't think it's most important yet. We still have to prove our importance. We still have to work it. We still have to, build that importance. And as much as I am really aware of the entire narrative that preceded the opening of the museum and that accompanied its launch, I believe that we have to keep that kind of hubris in check. I personally consider that the National Museum in Cairo is the most important museum on the continent. So just to put that in perspective, so I think it's important to understand that. Now, museographic narratives can differ, it is, at least I can tell you what we are trying to do at Dzeit Smoker. What we are trying to do at Dzeit Smoker is really to contribute to the writing of new chapters or different chapters of our art historical narrative. And when I was appointed last year, which came out of surprise, I didn't expect ever to become a museum director. And somewhat, I still think as an independent curator because I did it for so long. I think that it was important for us at the museum to sort of really understand what Dzeit Smoker can be, what Dzeit Smoker should become, and what we can do to make it happen. On the other level, we were also considering what is it in our contemporary art historical narrative that needs to be said, that needs to be shown, that needs to be written, that needs to be done. And we came to the understanding that for the last, let's say 25 years, at least since I am in the field as a conscious professional, there have been so much conversation around the artistic production on the continent, or from the continent and its diaspora. And a lot of those conversations were really happening outside of the continent, and they still happen a lot out of the continent, and particularly when you speak about exhibitions, you know, major important exhibition of contemporary African artists were initiated either outside the continent or, you know, circulated there. Okay, we have the biennials on the continent, which are very important and so on, but cannot, I mean, a biennial cannot be understood in the same way. So looking at that, we realized that there is very little work done on what we called tracing artistic genealogies. And by tracing artistic genealogies, we think of the fact that there were so many group shows. I mean, whenever there is an exhibition of artists of the continent, it's in a group show most of the time. 9 out of 10 exhibitions were group shows. So we understood that there was as much as, I mean, we all love group shows in a way. I am part of, you know, people who also contributed to the amount of groups that exist from artists from our territory. But at the same time, I understood more and more how group shows are not, you know, the field that we should follow in the museum. That doesn't mean that we will not do group shows, but we want to focus on individual voices. We want to focus on indices, and we want to really look at how those individual practices relate to others, and how they have inspired others, or how they have been inspired by others. And this is what I mean about artistic genealogies. So this is what we decided to do, and this is what we are focusing on, you know, with a program that also looked at experimental practices. I mean, not necessarily experimental practices within itself from the practice of the artist, but institutional experiment. You know, for instance, when we invited Kimangwale Hulere to bring his studio to the museum, it was an experiment because in conversation with the artists, I realized that, first of all, I have this current always frustration that when you go to a museum, you see the end product, but you don't see the entire process that feeds into a work, that feeds into a practice. So we invited Kemang to bring his studio to the museum. It was very challenging. It was very interesting, challenging for the artist, challenging for the institution. But I think that we will do more such experiment as well. We also open a project room, and the project room is really a space of more or less kind of carte blanche and free space for very young emerging artists who have naturally had a museum presence or a museum show. And we focus really quite strongly, of course, on those solo shows, which are most of the time, and what we want to do. I mean, it's only 1 year that I took over the helm of the museum. What we want to do is really like mini surveys / retrospective. So the next big one that we are working on is Tracy Rose, and another survey from Senzeni Marasella, and so on and so on. I don't know if I answered your question. You asked about demographics, how we reach out to the public. But I think you know, the museum is closed since 4 months. You know, so the impact of COVID-19 is quite severe on the museum, and the lockdown regulations in South Africa were quite severe, are still quite severe. So we are now in lockdown level 3. We can legally reopen, but we will take our time, because we are sort of revisiting a lot of things, because we believe that this situation that we found ourselves in on a global scale is so seismic that we cannot just resume as business as usual. We need to sort of, how do you say, acknowledge that, and acknowledge that on many levels, on an institutional level, on the financial. We acknowledge it on the financial level anyway, because, you know, ticketing visitation is one part of the business model of the museum. And so if the museum closed since 4 months, so you can imagine what that means for the museum. So,
but then that gave me the perfect opportunity to segue into my next question, which was, you know, with the museum being closed, there's also this kind of train of thought that we need to now incorporate digital technologies, right? Because there's a new generation, speaking of the word generation or genealogy, we could take it there, of African creatives who don't necessarily need to show their work physically within the confines of a museum. So when we speak about reinvention, this might be the perfect opportunity, don't you think, Koyo?
I don't think so at all. Art still needs to be seen in a physical way, because it's part of emotion, it's part of physicality. You know, of course, the digital space is important, is a space where you can bridge a lot of things, but you can never, I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned for the matter. I don't think that you can replace the experience of seeing art in a physical, in a real way. And all whatever the digital platform or the digital space offers us, if the work is not specifically made and conceived for the digital space, for it to be really as embedding all the features and mechanisms of the digital space, I think it is still quite utopian to believe that you can replace the human and physical experience of seeing.
And then, Sonia.
Hello?
Hello? Sonia, we're not hearing you, because I know that you wanted to speak about this, specifically because so many of the artists you work with don't even have a website.
So it's not only about replacing, it's just what service can we offer the artist and our audience, and the newer audience as well. So what I think, for instance, for one of the exhibitions, Free Borders, with the curator, we noticed that many of the artists across the regions don't have any online presence, be it website, Instagram. So some of them don't have any online presence at all. So while the curator was working, she visited over 35 studios of artists across the region, so in 4 countries. And she realized that it was supposed to be a behind the scene and documentation for us, because out of 35, only 8 were selected for the exhibition. But we realized that we have information and documentation that we can share with the other people. So what was supposed to be just inside and behind the scenes, we wanted to share it to the other people, so that a broader audience can be exposed and discover the work of these artists. So it doesn't mean that you replace the visit and the pleasure of seeing an artwork in itself, and the emotion and the pleasure, but it's just to enlarge the audience and give them more audience, a wider audience than what we have usually. So I think it's something that can complete the experience of visit. It won't replace it because it's not the same experience, but it's just something that can complete it. So for the time being, what we will do is that, oh, you don't hear me? I don't know. Here is it better?
Yeah, it's slightly better. Keep going.
So yes, no, because someone sent the message. So yes, so I think digital is also a means to support the artists and support their exposure and broaden their audience. So it will help them as well. So that's how I see it, and that's how we see it. So the digital is also a way for us to see and exhibit the behind the scenes of an exhibition, how it works, how it's organized. So yes, that's how we think it's useful.
I have a
Well,
question.
I really,
Yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
say something?
Go ahead,
I
Quayle.
really believe that, you know, we tend to think of either or, I mean, the digital is a support, and particularly now that we cannot physically gather, and that all gathering activities are restricted, that mobility is compromised for, I believe, the next 1 or 2 years, that of course the digital space is a space where you can bridge certain gaps, but I am very much, and I am adamant about it, against this idea of, you know, that we can just move everything to the digital. I think, and particularly when you consider art as a social science, the way I consider art as a social science, and that kind of human and physical practice that is embedded in many artistic practices that we deal with. So I think that even the younger generation, because when you're suggesting that the younger generation, so to speak, is so digital, and that they have no sense or no experience or no habit of, you know, having in human interaction or physical interaction with art, we have to teach them, you know. I think that it is very important to remind ourselves that art is a human science, is a social science that demands this physicality, at least the many practices that are still practiced today.
Yes, physicality, materiality, it's a place, when you go to an institution, it's also a place of gathering where you can share and go with friends. So it's also a place of gathering and experience, experimentation. So for that, I fully agree with you. It's just that I think digital can bring something else, but it won't replace, it's just, it adds another flavor. For instance, you know, Claude, where you're asking about the younger audience, what we began to do at the Palais de Lomé was to have storytellers. What is called, for instance, in Senegal, we have a strong tradition in West Africa of storytelling. In Senegal, we call it griot. In Togo, we have very good storytellers, people, also comedians, actors, and they were visiting the exhibitions with them. And of course, what they express, when you're a storyteller, you can sing, you dance, you speak, but in another way. Of course, what you add as experience is totally different from a single video or picture that you can see online. And this we miss. But it's just that online can reach another audience. And I think the question of audience is very important. And through online, you can have later, you can want to visit the venue because you've seen images that you liked online. And I'm speaking not only about the audience that is abroad, but even the local audience. The local audience, their curiosity, they are curious about the place because they've seen some pictures of it, pictures of exhibitions, pictures of the place. So I think it's good, it completes both of them. Of course, nothing will replace the physical presence.
I wanted to maybe ask Karen, since you're on a different continent, you're in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and you have a different set of challenges. Of course, the institution is still closed, but you also have to deal with the complexities of working with a Pan-African collection that ranges from the 11th century to even contemporary commissions. So how do you bring it all together in a physical and digital space?
Well, I'd like to echo the words of Koyo and just saying that with all things, I think museums need to restore and embrace humility to what we do. So I say that because we don't have it right yet, but we are still working and we experiment with different approaches. And to sort of further what Sonia was saying, to me, I think one of the challenges with digital is thinking of it as a replacement perhaps, or a dialogue with the physical, rather than how do we think of these things as expansions. So how can you have, I think the future of museums is actually going to become much more intimate. I think that the direction we're going into is probably going to be more docents, more human beings in the gallery. How do we make this visceral, physical, emotional connection to a work of art be something that engages with the human interaction? But then for those who don't have the ability to get into that building, what is it that you can do that is different? You can't just put a picture of something online and expect it to serve the same function. What can you do with an online platform that maybe would be interfering in the gallery? So one of the things that we do is with several exhibitions, in the exhibition itself, how can you give the space to allow the artworks to be in dialogue with one another, to allow them to breathe, to allow them to create the experience, but then either through smartphone technologies or webs or outside the gallery, so it's not interfering with the artwork, what are digital components that you can layer onto this, where you expand the experience of that, or you allow somebody who's not physically in the building to still tap into content that they might not otherwise have. And I think that that's really what we have to do, is recognize when you're in a physical space, how do you maximize the physical experience? When you don't have access to the physical experience, what's the thing do you want? Is it the voice? Is it the video of seeing inside somebody's studio? Is it wanting to hear, in the case of Yinka, who we were speaking about earlier, we had him, he provided a reading list. Emeka Ogbo gave us a playlist, and so did Jim Choo Choo. So for someone who's working in that realm, then you can expand what you offer online so that it becomes something different that is conducive to that platform. So when you're on the website for Emeka Ogbo's Market Symphony, you can't have the experience of a sound art immersion, but you can listen to Emeka speaking about Balogun Market. You can listen to his playlist. You can follow other directions and use it as a spring off point to maybe learn about Lagos in a new way. So it's thinking about those kinds of complements. And then in terms of the temporal stretch of this museum, to me, that's one of its greatest responsibilities and pleasures, is that, as for so much of the discourse on what gets classified as modern and contemporary African art, it's seen as a response to Western art history, and how can we recognize the particularities and specifics of African history and how they have led to the extraordinary talent that we see today as well. And so how can we shift the directions of these narratives? And one of the ways you can do that is through different kinds of juxtapositions of artworks. And so, fundamentally, as a philosophy, I see the museum as a space not of answers, but of questions. How can we try and put works of art together? How can we try and rejigger the experience of the museum building or its online platforms as a way of showing how complex these questions are? That, it's not my place to say who is African or where is African, because the answer is different depending on who you ask. But you need to be able to show that it can embrace all of this, and you need to allow people the opportunity to engage in recognizing that these conversations are far more complex than they have been treated, at least in the case of Western institutions to date. And so, one of the exhibitions I'm working on now and I'll get off, but it's looking at a king by the name of Lewanika, who reigned from 1878 to 1916 in what's now Western Zambia. It was then Brotsuland, but he was an artist, and he sold works of art from Livingston. He traveled to England. He had an exhibition at Taunton Castle. His artworks can be found in Zurich, in New York City, in Los Angeles. And yet, even though he was an internationally exhibiting artist, making art for the market and having an atelier in his school from which he taught future generations of artists, his story isn't as well known as other early modern artists. And so I think it's rethinking how we tell such histories of modernity and nationalism, that, you know, we offer a platform from which we can hopefully at least shift or expand on some of these conversations.
Thank you, Karen. Well, in the 9 minutes that we have left, and we might steal a couple of minutes since we started a bit late, I wanted to take a few questions. And the first one, I'm a bit biased because it's from Miliko Magosi, who sits with me on the board of trustees at Mass MoCA Museum. And he asked a question, which I think is very relevant for Sonia specifically, given the colonial history of the Palais de Lomé. It says, African art museums are also not exempt from decolonization. And I would like to hear more on this topic, because it seems that decolonization is aimed at museums in the West. As I understand it, decolonizing refers to the continual process of dismantling both visible and hidden cultural institutional forces derived from colonialism at a more global or trans-historical level. Now, I'll just have to say the question is quite complex, because Miliko is an artist as well as being an educator at Yale. But Sonia, do you want to take a stab at answering Miliko's question?
Yes, I think the theme of decolonization, we are, of course, because of the difficult history of the building itself, it's about decolonization, but there are several ways of decolonizing a place. First, the way you exhibit the exhibition and present the exhibition. So, for instance, one of the exhibitions we have that is called Togo of the Kings is an exhibition curated by a writer, a Togolese writer. And the theme, the way we stage it, it's around proverbs. So Togolese proverbs. So it's not a typical narration. It's not the typical way of expressing things. It wouldn't have happened in such a way in a Western museum. For instance, another thing is that the objects are still alive, so to say, today. They are still used, and they were borrowed from, we borrowed them from people from several regions of Togo. So even the way we do it, because normally a typical exhibition would gather objects from collectors or other institutions all over the world to present. Here we decided to showcase what we have in Togo and what people are still using. So it's another way of telling a story. And I think you can tell stories in so many ways that are very different from the typical Western point of view of expression, of how to work. And as Koyo said, art is also social science. It's human science. And it's also, this place at Palais de Lomé is also about biodiversity. And what we want to showcase is the ethnobotany. So the traditional Togolese know-how, or at least the Togolese know-how transmitted from generation to generation about botany and plants. How the plants were traditionally used to strengthen human system, or for, I would say, spiritual reasons. So also all this is part of a conversation that obviously in another context, in a so-called colonial or at least different context, it won't be the same narrative. And so, yes, I think it's one of the ways to answer.
Yeah, there's another question here that came actually.
Yeah, I mean,
did you want to add something, Koyo? Yeah.
Yes, I really think that, I mean, the social sciences, or kind of the development of thinking and you know, artistic thought, and in that realm is always comes up with many things. I really have an issue with the entire decolonization concept, you know, because I believe that it is very difficult for us in these organizations and institutions to do like proper decolonization work when our governments daily sell us out to neocolonialism, you know, on a daily basis. So how can you decolonize? Because whatever step forward you make, there are 10 steps, you know, that takes you backwards. So that's one thing. I think that this has to be unpacked because it is linked, you know, in a very clear way. The other point is that I rather speak about reappropriation. Reappropriation of systems of productions and systems of knowledge, systems of mediation and systems of translations that are more adequate to our histories. So, and in that, I mean, if at the example of Said Smoker, is there is a whole institutional structure that it's still a work in progress, but that's one thing. But in our exhibition schedule and knowledge production program, because most of our exhibition are also coming with substantial graphs, we pay very close attention to the narrative and the knowledge that we produce that is endogamic, if you want, you know, or endogenous, and this is how we try to participate in a writing of self, or in the writing of ourselves that really reflects the ideas and the systems that we have developed. So I really rather speak about reclaim of our knowledges, because we have been raped so many times and we continue to be raped somehow. So we need that space, or we need to create those spaces. And the museum can be a perfect platform to do that.
Yes, and I think our institution should be places of freedom and independence. And the artists themselves, their practice and the way they see the world, they are independent. Of course, obviously, we have this issue of real independence that the majority of the African countries haven't reached what we call 100% real independence. But I think that we have spaces of independence and spaces of way to think in another manner. And the museums, the institutions are places where you can propose something else and tell another story. Tell a story that is very different from what the media or other means show about Africa.
Well, Sonia, yeah, there's a related question that came in, and this is probably, unfortunately, going to be our last question. I wish we had more time, but the question, which is related to all three of you actually, is, do you have some sorts of collaborative practices or some tools to coordinate shows, resources, staff, etc.? Is there a kind of network of African museums? And this is being asked especially for museums located on the African continent, but I think it'd be important for Karen to weigh in as well. So perhaps you and Koyo can start, and Karen could have the last word.
Well, you know, Koyo used an expression that I really like a few weeks ago, is radical solidarity. So I hope we will have this solidarity and partnership between our institutions to be able to produce something out of it, be it exhibition, curatorial, exchange of knowledge, practices, I don't know. It's quite opened.
Koyo, do you see the beginning
Oh,
of
definitely.
network?
I mean, you know, my entire work in this field has always been about opening arms and opening doors. So I will continue the same thing at Said Smoker, and also I also believe that it is very important for our field on the continent to really develop those exchanges. But at the same time, you know, I really have to stay very realistic. It's a matter of possibilities. It's a matter of means, you know, and we have to look at a post-COVID environment that would be fundamentally different, but holding each other's hand. And I think, I mean, radical solidarity it begins just by thinking well, You know, it's not necessary. Of course, actions and, you know, programs and collaborations are important, but just thinking well, just, you know, take consideration of your neighbor, of your colleague in the other country. For instance, we are running this head-to-head conversation since I started them in April. It is a form of radical solidarity, talking to my colleagues in the field, discussing different matters. So yes, definitely, we want to share exhibitions, we want to share knowledge, we want to share staff, and we will. Think that we have to stay very humble, because there is not such a thing as a solid ground, as Otto Bonkanga says. We have no solid grounds anymore.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Karen?
And I must admit that, thank you, Koyo. She's been very supporting. She has very nice words. And I've received messages at the opening of the Palais. I received very positive and supportive messages from people in Ethiopia, Botswana. They said, they just send messages to say, well, you're very happy that something, that an institution happens in Africa, and we wish you all the best. And it was very surprising for me and very heartwarming, I would say, to receive such positive messages from many parts of Africa that I wouldn't have thought of initially.
Go Togo, go Togo. Karen, what's your last word?
Well, everything everyone said, but to this I would add that, you know, part of what dialogue needs to look like in the restructuring of museums is also how we create our content, and that I think the model of the museum authority is what needs to go, and, you know, how are exhibitions created in communication with the artist, you know, working with artist knowledge. How do you, where the artist isn't in a position to be able to speak for themselves, how are you working with communities to rethink the manner in which presentation takes place and knowledge is shared and distributed? And this is also, I think, because of the extraordinary work of Koyo and Sonia and Othman and
Othman from Macau. Yeah,
yes,
from Macau and Marrakesh.
And Addis, I mean, people, you know, all over the continent are really reshifting all of these power dynamics, and that's so instrumental, because in addition to keeping the knowledge on the continent and sharing it there, it changes how the representation does happen elsewhere. I would hope that museums like the Smithsonian become more effective platforms for the knowledge coming from the continent to have, you know, access to the US and then to travel to, you know, the Tate, and to travel to Centre Pompidou and so forth, that, you know, that these become receiving end. How do we get out of the way of saying that we control the knowledge, and how do we become better partners and platforms for, you know, sharing?
Thank you, Karen. I wanted to read one last question before we conclude, and it's from Bushra Khalili. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer her question, but it had to do with the fact that the digital space tends to lead to confusion, where we believe that more followers means more viewers. So Bushra believes that it's time to create an audience for virtual space where engagement with, and real viewing is what really matters, and delivering real information is what really matters, versus chasing followers on social media. So I think it's important to talk about that. And if I'm gonna actually remember two words from this discussion, it would have to be humility and solidarity. So I'm glad, Koyo, you led the way with those two words. I think we need more of that in this age of COVID, and more humility, more solidarity will go a long way, I believe. And with that, I wanna thank my three panelists, Karen Milbourne, Sonia Lawson, and Koyo Kuyo, and of course, Touria Elglaoui Margouil and the wonderful team at 154. And we hope to see you physically in person, not online, sometime soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon, great evening, great morning, whatever it might be. Bye.
Yeah.